occasionally wrote some C++, and that's what we're gonna be doing today. We're gonna take a look at embedding this single-threaded C++ web server. It's called Mongoose, and we're gonna take a look at how to use it in our own application, how to set it up, and how to serve static HTML files with this web server. So I'm just gonna show you now what we're gonna be building today. So the first thing you notice is we're gonna be working with Visual Studio, and we'll be building this simple terminal where you can start up the web server on the port you want to. So let's say you want to start a web server on port 900. So we're just gonna say 900 and press enter. And as you can see, the web server started on port 900. So I'm just gonna open up my browser and refresh. And as you can see, it's serving our index page that I have created in the root of the web server folder. Now this is just a normal HTML file. And you can also load other HTML files like this, for example like this, and about us page. And we also got some 404 error handling. So if I just do like this, as you can see, we get not found. So let's get started with implementing this web server. Alright guys, so let's get started with building this or embedding this web server. So we'll go ahead and fire up Visual Studio, create a new project, make sure you select Visual C++ and create an empty project, and let's name this project web server. And just hit OK, and you can set the location of your project here as well if you're not familiar with how to do that. And just hit OK, and now we got this entire blank project which we're gonna start working with. So the first thing we need to do is open up Mongoose on GitHub. Just Google for Mongoose C++ GitHub. Mongoose is spelled like this, and as you can see, it's supports working as a HTTP server, which is what we will be working with today. And you can read a little bit about it here if you want to. It's a single-threaded async non-blocking core. And you can see some examples up here, and read a whole lot about it if you want to. So what we're gonna do is open up mongoose.c and mongoose.h. So this is the C file and this is the header file, and we're just gonna copy them to Visual Studio. So just go ahead and select all this code and copy it all. Go to source files, add new item, and just mark the C++ file, and we're gonna name it mongoose.c. And paste all the code you just copied, save it as mongoose.c. Then we're gonna open up mongoose.h, the header file. Go to Visual Studio and select add new item, and mark the header file. And we're gonna name this mongoose.h for mongoose header. Click add and copy all the code, or paste all the code you just copied. And then finally we're gonna create a new file, CPP file, and we're gonna name this, let's name it main. This is gonna be the main file for this project, which we will run the terminal and start the server from. So just hit add. So what we're gonna do now, I'm just gonna add some comments. You don't have to do this. This is just gonna be the workflow for us. So let's say number one, we will create a function, an int, data type int function called main. It's gonna be a terminal where a user can define a server port to start the server on. Step 2 is gonna be creating a function of data type int called init server. This is gonna actually start the actual server for us and create the listening connection. So it's gonna say create the server listening connection. And finally, step number 3 is creating the event handler for the web server. This is gonna be a static data type void function called event handler. And the event handler is simply gonna serve static HTML files in this case. So just like that. So what we're gonna start with doing is including the Mongoose header file. So yes, let's say include mongoose.h, which is the file we just copied from GitHub. We're also gonna need a string library. So include string. And we're also gonna need the IOStream library. So let's say include IOStream. And we're gonna start by defining a structure, our struct, which contains settings for how to serve HTTP via the Mongoose server. So we're gonna say static struct mg underline serve underline HTTP underline opts for options, and we're gonna say s underline HTTP server ops. So I'm just gonna write a little comment here. Struct containing settings for how to serve HTTP with Mongoose. So what we're gonna do now is we're gonna go ahead and create the actual main function, which is step 1. So what we're gonna say is int main. Let's just pass a void here, and we're gonna declare a data type integer variable called port. We're also gonna say std cout, and I'm not using std as a namespace in this case. I'm referring to it this way instead. So we're gonna say std cout to let the administrator or you select the server port, and we're gonna say std and line for a new line, and then we're gonna create a cin, which is gonna be the actual port. So this lets the user type a port, which is gonna be an integer called port. So now let's say the user maybe types a character instead of an integer, so we have to say let's say it's fail case, and let's say if std cin fail. In other words, port is not an integer data type. We just gonna set the port to 1000. And then we're just gonna call a function which we will create soon, which is called init server, which will start the actual connection to the server. And we're gonna pass in the port, which the user defined, or if it's not defined, it's set to 1000. And let's just say return 0 here. So now this is marked red, of course, because this function does not exist yet, but we will create it in the next step. So I'm just gonna pause here real quick so the video doesn't get too long here, and I'll be back in a second. So I'm back again. So what we just did is we created the shell for the simple terminal where we're gonna define the port before we start the actual web server later. So that's step 1. Now we're gonna move on to step 2, which is creating this function init server, which will create the actual server connection, or the listening connection. So we're gonna go down here below the struct right here. We're gonna create the function, so just int and init server. And in this function, we're gonna pass port as an argument, which is an integer. And this is then of course the port we're setting from the terminal, alright? So we're gonna pass it into the init server so we can use this port variable later to decide on which port we want to start the server. So the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna declare the Mongoose event manager. I'm just gonna write a comment there, and it's gonna be a struct named Mongoose mg underline mgr, and then yes, let's say mgr. Then we're gonna also create a struct for the Mongoose, connection. So we're gonna say struct mg underline connection, which is a pointer, and let's name it nc. So now what we're gonna do is when starting the actual web server, we want to use this variable, the port, the integer, as a char variable. So we're gonna convert the port variable to a char. So we're gonna say std string, let's name it port to char, equals with std let's see here, to string, so we get an actual string from the port. Then what we're gonna do is we're gonna create a static char, which is gonna be constant, and we're gonna say point it to sport, or create a sport variable, and it's gonna be equal to the port to char dot c string. So now we actually got a char variable from this port integer, alright? So this sport variable is what we're gonna use to set the actual port later. So now what we're gonna do is we're gonna initialize Mongoose, the actual server itself. So what we're gonna do now is we're gonna say mg underline or mgr underline init, and we're gonna say and mgr and then null. So now we're actually passing the Mongoose event manager. So right here, the Mongoose event manager as a pointer, which means that we're actually pointing to an address in memory in this case. So this will actually initialize the server and start the server. So what we're gonna say is std out, just to print to the console, and we're gonna say, let's say, starting web server on port, and let's say sport, which is of course the port we're setting from the terminal, and let's say std and line for a new line. So now we're gonna create a listening connection with the event manager, the port, and attach an event handler to it, and later we'll also create the actual event handler, right? You will see soon. So we're gonna say nc equals with mg mongoose bind, and once again we're gonna pass in the Mongoose event manager. So end manager followed by the port, followed by the event handler, and this is a function that we will create in just a couple of seconds. So now what we're gonna do is we're gonna check if this connection was created successfully. So we're gonna say if the connection fails. So if NC, which is the connection, equals with null, that this means the connection could not be created. We're gonna say stdc out to write to the command prompt once again. Failed to create listener, and yes, the std end line, and let's return 1. So, but if it succeeds, the next thing we want to do is we're gonna set up some HTTP server parameters, some options for the actual server. So let's just say server options. So what we're gonna do now is first thing we're gonna say mg set protocol underline HTTP WebSocket, and we're gonna pass in the connection. So now what we're gonna do is we're gonna attach a built-in HTTP event handler, which we will create soon, which parses incoming data and triggers HTTP specific events that we will create soon. Then we're gonna set up what directory we want to serve our HTML files from. So we're gonna say s underline HTTP server underline ops for options dot document root. So in this case we're just gonna serve the actual files from the current directory. So in other words, the directory where the actual web server is running. We're also gonna set to enable directory listing or not. So we're gonna say s underline HTTP underline server ops dot enable directory listing, and we're gonna say this to set this to yes. And now this is of course if you want to enable directory listing or not. In this case we're gonna set it to yes. If you don't want to be able to list the directories in the browser, you're gonna set it to no. So now we're gonna say for we're gonna create an infinite loop instead of writing. This is the same thing as writing while true, but we're gonna write it this way. So we're gonna say mg underline mgr poll, and we're gonna say gonna pass in the event manager and then say 1000. All right, so once that's done, we're gonna free up all memory that has been allocated up to this point, and we're gonna use a built-in function in Mongoose for this. So mg underline mgr underline free, and pass in the event manager. So end manager, and let's just return 0 here. So that's it for creating the actual connection to our server and setting it on the specified port. So now what we got to do, which is the last step, so step 3, is we're gonna create an event handler for this server that's gonna serve static HTML files. So above the init server function, we're gonna say, let's say, just add a comment, event handler, and this is gonna be a static void named event handler, just as we defined down here, right there. And here we're gonna pass struct with the connection, so mg connection, pointer to nc. Pass the event and also a void named p. All right. I'm actually not quite sure what the P does in this case, but that's how you create an event handler in Mongoose. So now we're gonna say if event is a HTTP request, what we want to do is say if event equals with mg underline let's say mg underline ev HTTP request. We want to serve static HTML files, so we're gonna say mg serve HTTP, pass in the connection, so NC, followed by the actual message, the HTTP message, which Mongoose requires, so HTTP message. And then we're gonna pass in the P, and then finally we're gonna say HTTP server ops for passing in the server options we just set down in the init server function right here. So that's it for the event handler. So now we actually got the main function ready. We got the init server ready for creating the connection, and we got the event handler for handling requests, HTTP requests in this case. So we're just gonna go up here and try to build it now. Let's see if we got any errors. It seems like it built successfully, so let's just start it up. And let's see here, select server port, let's say 900. Starting web server on port 900. So let's open up a browser and let's say HTTP localhost 900. And yeah, you can see we get the directory listing right here. We haven't got any HTML files yet, so it won't be serving any files. So open up any text editor. I'm using Sublime here, and I already got this folder open. So I'm gonna go into web server, which is the project we created, the debug folder, and I'm gonna say new file, save it as index.html. And since we're building the project in debug mode, it ends up in the debug folder instead of the release folder. So I'm just gonna create a simple HTML document. Let's say hello world. Let's add a h1 tag and say index page hello, and let's see if it's loading the index page now. No, of course it's not, because we're running it from Visual Studio. So just gonna stop the server there, so we're not taking up the port, and go into the folder where you created the project, so you can start the actual web server from there. Then it will be looking inside its own directory for index.html, which should be correct. So let's say 900, starting web server on port 900, and let's update. And yes, you can see it's working now. So let's say we would type about.html. It's not found because that file doesn't exist, so we get a 404 not found error. So what we can do is just create a new file. Let's save it as about.html. And let's say HTML, and let's create a h1 tag, and let's say about us, and let's see if we get, yeah, as you can see now it's serving the about.html file. And if we go back to the start page, we're getting the index page, and if we type something that doesn't exist, we get a not found. So yeah, that's how you can implement a web server. I've actually implemented this myself in a in Chrome, in the Chrome V8 engine, and did get a really fast server that way. So you can just play around with it. So yeah, I hope you learned something. Bye bye.